In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the largest army Europe had ever seen into Russia. More than 600,000 soldiers from across his empire marching east with confidence and pride, because Napoleon believed this campaign would be quick and decisive, just like his earlier wars, and he expected the Russian army to stand and fight one great battle where it would be crushed, forcing the Russian Tsar to surrender. But the Russians had learned from Napoleon's past victories and chose a completely different strategy. Instead of defending their cities or borders, they retreated deeper into their own land, pulling back again and again while burning crops, emptying villages, and destroying food supplies so the French army would find nothing to eat. And as Napoleon continued to advance, he believed the retreat meant fear and weakness. But in reality, every step forward made his situation worse, because his army was now moving farther away from its supply bases in Europe, stretching supply lines that were already struggling to keep up with such a massive force. As the army marched east during the hot summer months, soldiers began to suffer long before any major battle was fought. The heat was exhausting, clean water was hard to find, and food became scarce almost immediately. Diseases like dysentery and typhus spread rapidly through crowded camps where hygiene was poor, and thousands of men fell sick and were unable to continue, while horses collapsed in enormous numbers from hunger and exhaustion, which created a disaster of its own, because horses were essential for pulling wagons that carried food, ammunition, and medical supplies. And when the horses died, the wagons were abandoned, leaving soldiers with even less food and forcing them to carry what little they could on their backs. And as discipline weakened, more men dropped out of formation, either falling behind or deserting, so that entire units slowly melted away along the roads without ever being attacked. By the time Napoleon reached the city of Smolensk, the reality of the campaign was already clear. Tens of thousands of soldiers were gone, not defeated in battle, but lost to hunger, sickness, exhaustion, and the endless march. Yet Napoleon refused to turn back, believing that one decisive fight would still save the campaign. And when the Russian army finally stood its ground in September at Borodino, the result was one of the bloodiest single days in European history, with massive losses on both sides. But even this terrible battle did not bring the victory Napoleon needed, because although the French held the battlefield, the Russian army was not destroyed and withdrew once again, leaving Napoleon with heavy losses and no peace. But still convinced that capturing Moscow would force a surrender, he pushed his exhausted army forward. When the French entered Moscow, they expected a rich city filled with food, shelter, and supplies where they could rest and recover. But instead, they found a city that was almost completely empty, and soon fires broke out across Moscow, started by Russian forces who chose to burn their own capital rather than let Napoleon use it. And within days, much of the city was destroyed, leaving the French with little shelter and almost no food. And Napoleon waited in Moscow for weeks, expecting the Russian Tsar to ask for peace, but no message ever came. While discipline collapsed, looting increased, and soldiers grew weaker by the day. And as time passed, the weather began to change. Nights grew colder, frost appeared on the ground, and the reality of winter became impossible to ignore. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat in October, the army was already badly weakened. But the retreat turned suffering into total collapse, because the soldiers were forced to march back across land they had already stripped bare during the advance, with no crops, no animals, and no villages left to provide shelter. And as winter arrived suddenly and violently, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers who lacked proper winter clothing froze to death at night, sometimes dying while marching or sitting beside small fires that could not keep them warm. Frostbite turned fingers, toes, and faces black. Wounds that would have healed in summer became deadly in the cold. Weapons cracked and broke, and hunger became constant as men were reduced to eating scraps, leather, and even frozen horse meat. As the retreat continued, order completely disappeared. Officers struggled to keep control as units mixed together, and ranks lost meaning. Men no longer marched in formation, but moved in desperate groups focused only on survival. And morale collapsed as rumors spread that no help was coming, and that the army was already lost, while Russian Cossack units followed closely, striking quickly at the edges of the retreating columns, capturing wagons, killing stragglers, and spreading fear, forcing the French to keep moving even when exhaustion made rest impossible. And many soldiers simply sat down in the snow and never stood up again. The disaster reached its peak at the Berezina River, where what remained of Napoleon's army nearly ceased to exist. Russian forces closed in from multiple directions, threatening to trap the French completely against an icy river. And in desperation, French engineers worked day and night to build temporary bridges under enemy fire, while thousands of soldiers, wounded men, and civilians tried to cross as quickly as possible, pushing, slipping, and falling into the freezing water, where many drowned or froze within minutes, while others were crushed in panic as the bridges collapsed behind them. And although part of the army managed to escape, the losses at the river were enormous, and the retreat continued in chaos. When the survivors finally crossed out of Russian territory, the once great Grande Armée no longer existed as a fighting force. It was a broken collection of starving, sick, and wounded men, many without weapons or uniforms, barely able to march. And out of the more than 600,000 soldiers who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out, with some estimates suggesting fewer than 30,000 were still capable of fighting, meaning the vast majority were not killed in battle but destroyed by hunger, disease, cold, exhaustion, and the complete collapse of logistics. And the campaign shattered Napoleon's image of invincibility, encouraged his enemies across Europe to rise against him, and changed the balance of power on the continent. The Russian campaign proved a brutal lesson that remains true in warfare, that an army does not always need to be defeated in a great battle to be destroyed, because distance, weather, and time can be just as deadly as any enemy. And when planning ignores reality and overconfidence replaces caution, an army can march forward, believing victory is certain, only to realize too late that the real battle was never against another army at all, but against the land itself. And by the time that truth becomes clear, there is no way back.